It looks like everyone is trickling in, so we can go ahead and get started. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Should you have any questions during the event, please submit them at the bottom of the screen via your Q&A functionality. And again, we hope that you are grabbing a drink in the safety of your own home and joining us for this fantastic conversation. That being said, Andres, over to you.
Hello, I just dropped my phone. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Andrés Martinez. I'm the editorial director of Future Tense, which is a collaboration between Slate Magazine, New America, the think tank, and Arizona State University, where I also teach in our Cronkite School of Journalism. And as Angela mentioned, as we were getting started, this is part of a series that we're doing. It's called Social Distancing Socials, where we're trying to engage with followers and folks more rather than less in this time of when we're all on virtual house arrest, because the issue of how technology is impacting society and our lives has never been more acute or relevant and interesting. And speaking of, so when it comes to interesting, I have to say today's social is very indulgent on my part, because I'm using work as an excuse to bring together two of my favorite people and some of the more interesting thinkers I know, and then being able to share it with our audience. So it does feel very indulgent, particularly since I know the two of you are also incredibly busy. But if I threw a dinner party, you probably wouldn't come. But I'm so glad to have this work excuse to talk to you guys. So first I want to introduce, I don't know if he's to your left or to your right, depending on your screen, but in the sort of orange top is León Krauze, who is so many things. I mean, I think I could spend 1 hour just, we would burn up the hour talking about all the various things you do. I feel like there are like a dozen León Krauzes roaming around roaming the earth, because you do so many things. But León, for those of you who don't know, has done a lot of podcasts with Slate, writes a column for Slate, also writes a column for the Washington Post, but we won't mention that. He is, one of the León Krauzes is also the news anchor of KMAX, which is like one of the coolest call station signals or whatever you call those things, for the Univision broadcast in Los Angeles, which has to be, I think, one of the most watched local newscasts anywhere in the world, or at least it was before León showed up. I don't know if it still is, but León also is a very well-known, great radio personality in Mexico before he picked up and moved to LA a while back. And just there's a very serious León Krauze out in the world who also writes about the history of soccer. So that's so many León Krauzes. Anyways, thank you so much for being here, León, with us.
Thank you, Andres.
And then we have Charles Kenny. Charles is, I should look at your formal title before starting to just describe you randomly. You're the Senior Fellow and Director of Technology and Development at the Center for Global Development. I first became a Charles Kenny fanboy when I read an article you wrote, I believe it was in Foreign Policy back in the day, talking about the power of television to be a messenger for public health improvements and awareness, and the messaging that would go into soap operas in Brazil and India, I think it was, in terms of public health messaging, which seems very relevant to today's conversation. And then as a result of that and other engagements that we had, you were a fellow at New America, and now you're at the Center of Global Development. I think your fellowship in New America was one way to rescue you from a thriving, successful career at the World Bank. But one of the things that's very popular these days are these apps that calm people. You know, there are meditation apps, and if you have trouble sleeping in times of anxiety, you can download these apps. I would suggest that instead of downloading one of those apps, if you ever feel anxious about the state of the world, just call Charles Kenny and he will soothe you and put you at ease. And so at the end of this broadcast, we will share with folks Charles' cell phone number so that you can do that. Doesn't matter what time zone you're in, just call Charles. Charles has written several books. One of the books that he wrote that's very apropos of the conversation today, the title was Getting Better, Why Global Development is Succeeding and How We Can Improve the World Even More. Most recently, you wrote Close the Pentagon, Rethinking National Security for a Positive Sum World. But I want to start the conversation, Charles. Help us set the scene. We're supposed to be talking about, how humans have never had it this good. And can we still say that? And, those of us who are fortunate to be able to work from home are kind of on lockdown. So doesn't seem like the best of times, but kind of remind us why, when you think of global development and the sort of grand sweep of history, which is how you tend to think of things, and one of the reasons I admire your work so much, kind of remind us why we have it so good right now.
So I used to write a piece pretty much every year, sometime between Thanksgiving and New Year's, saying this is the best year ever. And I could keep on writing the piece because it kept on being true. If you look at global poverty, the proportion of the world who lives on less than $1.90 a day, which is a kind of the World Bank standard for absolute extreme poverty, used to be most of the world, and now it's or at least last year it was below 10%. If you look at infant mortality, child mortality, it's been dropped by about 2/3 just between 1990 and 2015. You look at the levels of violence worldwide; they've been dropping over until recently. The number of people living under a democracy was going up. Sort of choose your measure, and it was heading in the right direction. I should say, though, that in the last few years, I've stopped writing that yearly column on how this is the best year ever. Predating COVID, frankly, we'd seen at least a flatlining and some reversal in global trends towards democracy. And this year, sadly, I think it is very clear we're going to see reversals probably in global life expectancy, certainly in global poverty. So maybe you don't want to call me up for soothing advice anymore. I would say, though, still that this pandemic is already has affected so many lives in so many terrible ways, and we haven't responded to it nearly as well as we should have done. I'd still say we're responding to this pandemic better than we have in the past to previous pandemics. So, even sort of in the bad times, we're doing a bit better than we used to when it comes to responding and trying to limit the harm and the suffering worldwide.
So a lot of the progress in recent years, and I'm thinking about maybe the run up to the UN Development Millennial Goals that were established at one point that countries were supposed to hit in 2015, and I can recall a few years back talking to you about those, and those were certain measures and objectives about the eradication of extreme poverty or its reduction and so forth, and some of the indices that you were talking about, which I hear you that recently they had been starting to plateau. So maybe sort of that sort of triumphal sentiment needs to be tempered. But there was a lot of debate around the fact that for better or for worse, the progress that we were seeing, and perhaps it's somewhat uneven distribution, was attributable to globalization, right? This amorphous term that we often throw out there, globalization. We kind of all have a sense of what it means, but maybe we don't quite define it as precisely as we should sometimes. But I want to pivot to León and ask you to reflect on the state of globalization today. You are kind of you have a front row seat, and you're a chronicler of Los Angeles, which is this teeming, amazing kind of daily symphony of all the things that we think of when it comes to globalization, whether it's the Cambodian donut shops or all the places you can get mole from Oaxaca, the thriving port of LA and Long Beach that funnels through so much of the trade for the entire country. You know, the nightly flow of all those flights going off to Europe, well, up until recently, and Asia, and LA as sort of this amazing metropolis that in some ways is like the second most important Mexican city, arguably, and
Yeah,
Persian
and
city, and
Salvadoran.
city, and Salvadoran city. And so, you know, you're living this kind of chaotic, wonderful, somewhat sometimes horrible, you know, whatever you want to adjective you want to use, you're living and chronicling, and you did it with that great book La Mesa, where you talked about the Latino, you know, immigrant experience in LA. So when you think of this moment, that this pandemic coming in the aftermath of a political rethink of globalization in some places, do you think that we're in for a regression, a retreat from globalization, or are we going to kind of come on the other side and think, you know what, we're more interdependent than ever before, and 5-10 years from now, are we going to see more coordinated responses to our economic life and responses to crises like this? I mean, it's a big question, but I'm eager to hear from you on that.
Well, Andres, first of all, allow me to apologize for my dogs, who are pretty noisy. They have stopped already, so I think we should be good. It's a good description of Los Angeles, what you just shared with us. It truly is a fascinating place. For me, the capital of Latin America in the United States, with all due respect to my friends in Miami. And the experience of living here has been a fascinating one, for sure. I would begin by saying that it's hard to argue that we have never had it this good when 16 million Americans, we just learned recently, are applying for unemployment benefits. And but I'm an optimist. I agree with Charles that the overall trends don't lie, and that humankind is still heading in the right direction. But there are questions that should linger and should occupy our attention. And one of them is immigration. You mentioned the work I've done in Los Angeles with the large immigrant community here with La Mesa, with this experiment of community-oriented journalism. And I've recently been writing about how the United States has been responding to the immigrant community's hour of need in this crisis. As we know, there are 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. They pay over $11 billion in taxes every year as well. And yet the government's historic, unprecedented stimulus package simply ignored them, did not provide 1 cent of aid for them. It provided support for Uber drivers, which is a great thing for the first time. But for the undocumented workers that, for example, make up 40% of the country's agricultural industry, nothing, zero, not 1 cent. And I think that this presents a real dilemma that goes to the heart of your question about globalization. It's a moral and economic dilemma, at least for the United States. I do think that it's interesting that the government has recognized the work of these people as essential during the emergency, or at least of those people who work in the fields and the food processing industry, because they are essential. Ideally, for me, the pandemic should help us realize just how essential the work and presence of immigrants in a society like ours really is. The idea that immigrants are unnecessary is a travesty, it's a fantasy. But the question remains, will this realization lead to a more sensible approach to immigration, or to a nativist backlash? I have been interviewing a couple of people recently for a column I'm writing, and one of them is the head of the main association of Mexican entrepreneurs in Los Angeles. And he told me that, of course, he's worried about unemployment, he's worried about the current situation in the short term, but mostly he says what concerns him the most is that this will trigger a larger nativist backlash that will strengthen the populist position that Trump came to power on, and we will enter a new phase of protectionism, of barriers, of borders, and prejudice. And I think that the question is right there in the air. I don't think we have a clear answer to that still. I'm an optimist, but the question is lingering there.
Yeah, it's I like the way you talk about how, you know, there's the present crisis, and you referenced the incredible unemployment claim numbers, and part of what I think we're starting to begin to wrestle with is the current emergency, and then also what will be, as you put it, the lingering questions and the aftermath. And I think the immigration piece of this is really important. You know, it's also not only do those workers pay all that in taxes, they're also sending home to Mexico close to $40 billion in remittances, which is important for the development of North America as a whole. And the other thing that I think we probably all of us have been thinking about this, the fact that in previous times of national crises and mobilization, and we think back to, you know, the U.S. going to war in World War II and thinking of the Greatest Generation. And I wrote a column about the fact that, like, when we think of the band of brothers that got us through that crisis,
yeah.
You know, you picture the soldiers in their GI uniforms. And now, you know, as you referenced, we're relying now on, you know, essential workers who are kind of like the frontline heroes of this battle, if you want to call it a battle. And, you know, obviously a lot of those folks are the healthcare providers and medical professionals. But we also are having to realize that the person, you know, shelving putting the food on the shelves in the grocery store, the farm worker who is, you know, picking those crops, and the people out and about cleaning, the transit workers in New York City, my gosh. I mean, and all of these communities are, you know, people who have been maybe taken for granted, if you want to put it charitably, if not exploited, if not underpaid, you know, and the reliance that we as a society have on that part of the population that where immigrants are disproportionately represented. It reminds me a little bit of the aftermath of 9/11 in New York, where there were official figures of casualties, and then there was a time lag, and the numbers would take a while to catch up because you had to add people who you know were delivering the food in the Twin Towers, and some of the staff that maybe was not officially registered. And, you know, it was this interesting moment where we were reminded of the fact that our economy and our society somewhat hypocritically relies to its benefit on people that are operating in the shadows. So Charles, I know that migration is one of your, you know, core subjects in terms of thinking about how it affects and impacts global development. And it's something that you guys at the Center for Global Development have done a lot of work on. So to this lingering question that León has posited, do you worry that we're going to see this retrenchment in terms of migration flows that might be prejudicial to global development? Again, understanding that this pandemic isn't coming out of the blue. I mean, it is happening on its own for its own reasons, but it's happening against a backdrop where the politics were already rethinking this, you know, push towards greater global interdependence and integration.
So you were asking, you know, you were saying we sort of throw around the term globalization without thinking really, you know, what's in it. I think one of the most important parts of globalization is the movement of ideas, and ideas move most easily when people move with them. And I think it is just unquestionable that one of the greatest force behind sort of global progress is people moving around the world sharing ideas. And if you look at Silicon Valley and the huge proportion of, you know, startups there that are founded by immigrants, you know, that's just one example. You were talking about the uncounted at the bottom of society, and I think when we talk about Silicon Valley, we sort of forget about the vital role that they play too. I mean, at the moment, across the Midwest, you're seeing farmers, screaming, saying they can't get enough people to bring the crops in from the fields. So I think you're absolutely right about that. As to where we go in the future, I think there's sort of two competing things going on right now, and a long-term trend that I hope pushes us back towards realizing quite how valuable migration is. Selfishly, forget its impact on global development, just for us. In the short term, you've got the fact that anybody wandering into a hospital realizes how important migrants are to the well-being of people in the United States. A goodly percentage of everybody you're going to meet in that hospital who's getting you healthier are migrants. On the other hand, you do have what is a kind of biological urge amongst people who face infection to get less friendly towards the other, towards other people. I mean, this isn't just humans. Animals who face lots of infection tend to be much less friendly towards outsiders, to people they don't know. It's something that we have inherited biologically, and so it's quite easy to make somebody express more anti-immigrant views, sadly, just by showing them pictures of people with measles. If you do that randomly amongst a sample of people, the people you've shown pictures of measles to will come out with more anti-immigrant attitudes. So there's sort of these two competing forces. One is our base instincts, if you will, to think about infection as being a problem of the outsider, and that makes us more anti-immigrant. On the other hand, the fact of the matter that the people who are helping us right now, who are making this situation more bearable than it would otherwise be, are migrants. In the longer term, my expectation is that we will move towards a greater understanding and appreciation of immigrants in this country purely on self-interest. And that's because we're going to get older, and we're going to want to retire. And if you look at the future of the United States, less so than other countries, but still true in the United States, we're seeing an aging population, and we're going to want somebody else to do the work when we're 80. And I think this is going to be a global phenomenon. And actually, my guess is in 20 or 30 years, we'll be talking about a migration crisis, and migration crisis will be there aren't enough migrants. We're going to see an increasing global competition for the migrants that are available. As I say, other countries have it much worse than the United States, partially because they have lower immigrant populations already. Japan at the moment has gone from being a country that basically tried to keep out all migrants to being one that's desperately searching for more people to come in and work in the country. China is aging as fast as Europe is. China and Europe are both going to find themselves in a similar position. Lots of people who don't want to work, who want to retire, who want to move on, and not very many people to fill the jobs. And so my guess is that in 30 or 40 years, we're going to see this sea change. And evidence is already there that it's happening. If you look at the younger people in Europe, in the United States, they're already much more pro-immigration. And it's because they realize that they're going to be left carrying the can of the economy, if you will, as older people retire. And so I'm optimistic in the long term that we'll see a reversal of this recent nativism. I admit in the short term, how these two different forces play out between surely a greater understanding of the role that migrants are playing in our society against our sort of base instinct to associate the threat of infection with the threat of the other. I don't know.
So we thought it might be fun to throw this question to those of you following at home, because I guess we're all at home, but to our audience, we're going to ask this poll question: long-term, will COVID-19 accelerate or reverse globalization? I know there's always some danger in these binary questions, but taking advantage of the poll functionality here of Zoom, we thought it'd be fun to sort of just get a rough sense of where you all are, because I think it is an interesting question that could go either way. And in the meantime, León, Since this conversation is in terms of the fate of humans and the human race is global by nature, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how you see the sort of cross-border relationship with Mexico and how this pandemic is playing out in countries like Mexico. Because I think one of the universal political trends of late has been a bit of a second guessing of technocrats everywhere. Part of the populist wave has been sort of a revolt against the kind of expert technocratic class that advanced globalization, that was part of this neoliberal, project, as people are fond of now critiquing it. And obviously we have a populist government in Mexico that is similar in some ways, very different in some ways from the administration in Washington, and has had its own, shall we say, idiosyncratic response to the pandemic in Mexico. And so, and this is playing out in a lot of different countries where this flavor of politics has taken hold. And, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about how you see things in terms of the cross-border dynamic and what's happening in Mexico and what that suggests for years to come.
Well, it's a big question. I would begin by saying that I think that one of there are a few silver linings to this horrendous crisis, this emergency that we faced in 2020. One of them is, I would argue, the resurgence of experts in the public sphere, Andres. In Mexico, an epidemiologist is now commanding the stage, not the president, although he has his daily press conferences every morning. If people in the United States think that President Trump's daily press conferences in the afternoon are a perfectly choreographed act of propaganda, they should tune in to Mexico's morning press conference to learn from the best. But in Mexico, just like in the United States, we have a scientist in charge, and I'm not talking. I'm talking about epidemiologist Hugo López-Gatell, just like Anthony Fauci in America. Now, having said this, let me mention another one of the silver linings that I think is interesting, which is that propaganda, for me, most propaganda has become almost useless politically. I mean, it is more difficult to spin narrative when we are not talking about more abstract concepts like immigration, rather than the immediate terrible reality of people dying. And I mean, this means that governments will be certainly judged, I would imagine, solely on their competence rather than on their ability to present alternative facts through their usual propaganda channels. And we see this in Mexico, we see this in Brazil, and we see this across the world in populist governments. In other words, I mean, not even Fox News can counter the reality of thousands of Americans dying of this disease. And I think that is a silver lining. In a way, reality, history, if you want to get a bit more metaphysical, even nature itself is calling populism's bluff. Now they have to answer the question: can you govern? Can you deliver on your lofty promises? And as of now, a number of those governments have failed to live up to their promise of good governance. Trump, of course, but also Jair Bolsonaro and, frankly, López Obrador in Mexico. And I think that we can at least hope that people in the U.S. and Brazil and Mexico and other places will not forget or forgive this particular failure that will certainly have an effect in not only the life of each country, but of course the relationship between both countries, thinking about Mexico and the United States.
I love how you put it, calling nature's bluff. And also our polling question, it's 46% of respondents feel that this crisis will accelerate globalization, 54% that it'll reverse. So I think that is another indication that these lingering questions are close calls and interesting.
Are we thinking in the short term or in the long term, though?
Well, that's in the short term. You know, I guess I would probably say it's hitting a pause, right? But yes, that was a little bit ambiguous and left up to people's interpretation. But if you have questions, you can submit them through the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. There was a question here about whether we feel that the COVID-19 crisis might lead to some breakthroughs in science and technology that could get us back on track of improving living standards. I should mention that Charles wrote a great piece for Future Tense on Slate, talking about the search for the vaccine, to spread the vaccine for smallpox in the 2 centuries ago, and how the response was more global than some of the responses we're seeing today. But Charles, do you have, as part of your sort of formerly optimistic bent, a sense that, you know, from these great moments, dire moments, you know, we can leapfrog, that it kind of gets, it's what we need to create certain breakthroughs, whether it's on public health or other fronts?
Sorry, yeah, so let me be a bit more characteristically optimistic. I'm coming through, okay. Nature was cutting me off as I was trying to be more optimistic. I think, as I sort of said at the beginning, that the chances are that we will deal with this pandemic not nearly as well as we should have done, but better than we've dealt with any previous pandemic. I think already you are seeing that. Chinese scientists figured out the RNA of this thing within a few days. Worldwide, we've got the World Health Organization organizing one of the first ever sort of global trials of 5 different treatments for COVID, including President Trump's favorite, the anti-malarial. We're seeing sort of global collaboration in work on vaccines. I hope that we will see, within maybe even if just a few months, that we've got an effective vaccine. It's going to take a lot longer than that to roll it out to everybody, but that would be an important first step. So I do think there's hope that we'll see much more rapid than in the past technological advance. I mean, after all, between the arrival of smallpox and the arrival of the first, of the world's vaccine, the smallpox vaccine was a matter of thousands of years. If we manage to do it in a few months, that's pretty impressive, and I think a sign of long-term global progress. On the subject of globalization, I saw the statistics earlier on today on US trade in various pieces of PPE, of personal protective equipment for medicine, for protection against COVID. If all you needed to deal with COVID was hand sanitizer, the United States would do fantastically in autarky. It produces a lot more hand sanitizer. It exports a lot more hand sanitizer than it imports. Pretty much when it comes to every other form of PPE, we import more than we export. So autarky would be a fairly disastrous short-term response for the United States. And I think even this administration is beginning to realize that the language at the sort of the start of the press conference will be, we're going to defund the WHO, we're going to put in trade barriers. And by the end of the press conference or soon after, that language is being rolled back. And I think that is, to Leon's point, sort of their bluff is being called. We can't actually deal with this thing as individual countries. The only way you can really treat an infection as a non-global issue is by completely cutting off globalization, by which I mean sort of going back to the point before Columbus traveled the ocean, right? I mean, you've got to cut off all trade and all movement of people, and nobody really expects or wants that to happen. So we have to treat this as a global issue. And while the World Health Organization, nobody would call its record perfect, I think it's done better this time than it did during the Ebola crisis of 2014. It's done a reasonable job, a better job than we might have expected in responding to this crisis. And the reason it hasn't done a better job still is it doesn't have enough power, it doesn't have enough money, it doesn't have enough responsibility, and it doesn't have enough respect. Two countries notably have been ignoring what the WHO said. China started by being late on reporting the extent of COVID-19 and what a serious public health issue it was. The United States, amongst many countries, has been completely ignoring WHO advice on travel bans. It ignored early WHO advice on effective testing. China, the United States, a whole bunch of other countries have to give the World Health Organization the respect it deserves and the financing it needs to respond to future pandemics. So my hope is that rationality will win out and we'll realize that there isn't really much choice out of this pandemic apart from to increase the power of global organizations like the WHO.
Mm-hmm.
Optimistic realism. The old Charles is back. A ver, Leon, anything you want to add?
I couldn't agree more. I think Charles put it very eloquently. While I was listening to him, I was thinking what comes afterwards, right? I've been reading up on the Black Plague and how it began and what came afterwards, and how humanity basically reclaimed the world after something that was far more horrific than what we're witnessing now, including the discovery of America, the Renaissance. So I am certainly an optimist, but I do think that there is a fascinating question to be asked: what comes afterwards? What kind of world is there waiting 5 months from now, or even a year from now? And what kind of world will we have to explain to our children? Charles made me think of a moment that happened just a year ago with one of my kids. We were at the airport, and he saw me taking my shoes off and putting them into the machine, and he looked at me. He's very inquisitive and asked me, "Dad, please tell me, why do you guys shoes off when we're going to go on an airplane? This is ridiculous, right?" And I told him, yes, it is ridiculous, but there's a reason for that. And so I told him the story of Richard Reed and how this guy wanted to blow up an airplane by a bomb that he was apparently, if I remember correctly, he had some sort of device in one of his shoes. And from that point on, the world changed. And every time an adult wants to get on an airplane, he has to take off his damn shoes and put them through the machine. So, and that kind of change that happened after one particular episode and changed the way we travel forever is just a very minor example of that I think we have to take and put into a larger perspective when it comes to what we're dealing with now. How will the urban landscape change? What industries will survive? And we have friends who work in the restaurant industry, small, medium, or large restaurateurs, food industry professionals who are now really wrestling with a brutal situation, and that's just one industry, and that is what keeps me up at night, among other things, including my very inquisitive child. What kind of world comes after this? Which industry survived? What the landscape will be like?
Will there still be middle seats on airplanes, or will there need to be social distancing
or sporting events? I mean, there are so many things that, frankly, it's not. It's important questions. Yeah.
Leon, I wanted to. I'm reminded that a few years back, you were incredibly generous with us at Future Tense. We did an event in Mexico City, and it was about whether technology is going to liberate us. So we had some title that was already somewhat provocative, because the sort of rethinking about the role of technology in our lives, I felt like was starting. 10 years ago. 10 years ago, people had this very utopian view that all these new technologies were going to solve all our problems. And then more recently, obviously, we've seen a climate where there's been more suspicion of big tech. So we had that event in Mexico City that you helped us do. As a result of that, Arizona State University has had a series of convergence lab events in Mexico, and you really were part of
You never invited me back.
helping to launch those. Well, we you know, we've gotten more modest.
What's up?
We rolled out the big star for the first one. But
I
on
see.
that question of technology, you know, we've talked a lot about globalization, and I feel like technology is another elephant in the room here when we talk about, you know, are things getting better or worse? And obviously, like if you're one of the big tech companies that was feeling pressure about antitrust or some of these debates in the political arena, maybe this crisis comes at a I don't want to say a good time, but you know, it might change the topic, right? And obviously now we're more reliant on technologies like Zoom to have these events, and people are ordering from Amazon, and with all of the questions that remain about privacy and so forth. But I want to ask, this is a question for both of you, like where do we, if we've talked about globalization now, where do we fit in technology in terms of our optimism going forward in terms of being more connected in constructive ways and dealing with these problems? Or is there sort of a dystopian future around the corner that this is only going to accelerate, and partly because of what technology is doing to our lives? Easy questions, all of these.
So I'll talk about a bit of that. One of the things that I'm really worried about, and Leona's talked about it too, is the impact of COVID so far is definitely a force for growing inequality. The people who are most likely to get COVID are those who are providing the vital services, mainly people who are, you know, the well paid, so levels for inequality. Obviously, the people who are being thrown out of their jobs, mostly already at the lower end of the income scale. This is going to be a huge force for inequality, and the government response so far in this country, I mean, congratulations on the cash transfers. I think that's a great move, but it was way too small. And so without sort of further government effort, this is going to be a force for increased inequality. That is kind of what I feel about technology too going forward. Well, which is to say, what matters here is government. Now, basically more productivity, I think, is a good thing. So I think that one of the big reasons that Africa remains a lot poorer than Europe is the fact that if you look at agriculture in Africa, a lot more of it involves people threshing by hand than in Europe or the United States. Machines increasing productivity leads to wealth. But unless you have government intervening, doing its part, it can lead to greater inequality. We have a bunch of tools that we really know work to deal with this problem. One you may have heard of is called taxation. And the fact that this is considered, you know, a complex and difficult issue, and what are we going to do about inequality if it turns out that technology continues to be a force for inequality? We have the answers. We've had the answers since, you know, I don't know, 1800. When did they first introduce the income tax? So I don't think this is rocket science. I think we have policy responses to deal with the economic downsides of these new technologies, and I think broadly they are a force for positive good if you deal with those economic downsides, at least you know, in terms of income and well-being. But that does leave aside the big and important and complex question of, well, what about privacy and, you know, issues like that?
Well, I mean, for us media journalists, Andrés, technology is a godsend, right? I mean, what we have been seeing with technologies like the one we're using now to communicate is fascinating, and it brings us together. And for me as a Univision newscaster, it makes it possible for me to broadcast from my home. If I turn the computer around, you would see a couple of tripods and a couple of lights, because I've been broadcasting from home. I'm completely I mean, healthy, but the company decided that we had to alternate my co-anchor and myself. So of course, I think technology is a force for good. But in other ways, I do think that this particular crisis, this emergency, should work as a sort of dress rehearsal or rehearsal for the two big crises that are coming up. I mean, in the near future, are here already. One of them certainly climate change, and the other one is artificial intelligence, automation, AI. Right? I mean, the enormous stimulus package that the government approved is very close to establishing some sort of universal basic income. And once again, the way governments react to this emergency, to this crisis, will in a way set the path to the way they will react to a crisis that is inescapable, because certainly the emergence of AI is already here, and the way that Andrew Yang has become such a relevant figure, I don't think it's a coincidence, and it will be part of the conversation in the coming years, and we will have to deal with it one way or another very soon.
One of the questions, while we're on this topic, so from Mia asks, we saw reporting that a great number of cases in Mexico were traced to some wealthy vacationers who brought the virus back after a ski trip in Vail. Do you think we'll see the pandemic stoke class tensions in Mexico?
Well, yes, there were some people who went to Vail, but that's certainly not the way the pandemic began in Mexico. I hope not. I hope not. I think that goes back to this previous part of the discussion about populist governments and how they are reacting, right? I mean, the president of Mexico, in an incredibly controversial statement, said that this, and you will help me translate this perfectly well, Andres, because I can't think of the phrase. He said that the crisis fit him como anillo al dedo, no? To a T, maybe, would it, no? Like it really fit the moment. I don't know how you can translate that. It
fits like a glove, I guess.
It feels like a glove. It feels like
literally
a glove.
it fits like a ring on their finger. But the idiomatic expression is like it fits like a glove.
That's exactly right. And what did he mean by that? What did he mean by that? Does that mean that he will use the crisis to steer this sort of cultural war, class warfare that he has used in the past? Will he grow even more authoritarian, like it has happened already in Hungary, for example? Those are open questions. Those are open questions. Just this week, he stepped up his confrontation with Mexican empresarios, the entrepreneurial class in Mexico. So my answer would be, I hope not, but it's certainly a possibility. It depends in many ways, sadly, of this messianic figure that we have in charge over there and how he decides to approach the crisis. With his approval ratings falling, I wouldn't be surprised if he tried to find some convenient scapegoats.
Also somewhat related, David Sasaki, hello David, asks, what are the likely long-term effects of the pandemic on informal workers? I think you both have alluded to this a bit, and Charles, I'm just curious about whether you see, I mean, speaking of, taking advantage of crises to affect change, like, are you optimistic that there might be some structural adjustments, and of course it'll vary country to country, but to address some of these structural inequalities? You've talked about taxation, but the workers in the informal economy, you mentioned Uber drivers, but these could be one-off measures, or do you think we're going to see like real structural changes in how we treat certain people in our economy?
So I'm hopeful to see change. I mean, and one of the places I think that's most important is in developing countries. If you look at developing countries, not only can they not afford the kind of health responses that we take for granted in rich countries. There are reasons for sort of optimism about the overall scale of a health emergency in developing countries because younger populations seem to do better when it comes to COVID, but there are also reasons for concern in that populations in places with bad air pollution, for example, do worse, and big cities in the developing world have pretty terrible air pollution. So just on the health side, there are reasons for optimism, there are reasons for fear. Pretty much there's no reason for optimism on the economic side. The knock-on effects of the global economic crisis that we're undergoing are going to be big in developing countries, and they're going to be big on health outcomes in developing countries, where small declines in GDP can have a big effect on health outcomes. So in the short term, I really don't see much reason for optimism, but my hope is that one of the big responses that we see in developing countries to deal with the income effects is much more use of cash transfers, something that would have been impossible 15, 20 years ago. But, you know, thanks to the expansion of mobile money, not least, is a lot more plausible now. A colleague was talking to a minister in Ghana about how many people he thought that they could reach sort of directly with cash transfers in the short term. He was saying 80, 90% of the population. That's would have been unheard of 10, 15, 20 years ago. So my hope is what we see is, as a response to this crisis, developing countries in particular putting in place broad-based cash transfers for, you know, when they're needed, and that's becoming something that they do more and more as a matter of course. Of course, in Latin America recently, including in Mexico and Brazil, we've seen things going the other way on those grounds, that large cash transfer programs have been reduced. My hope is they come back again now.
Yeah, Leon, do you have anything to add on that?
I couldn't agree more with what Charles is saying. I mean, my concern is that thinking of Latin America and developing countries at this particular moment, it really comes down to leadership, right? And I think there are examples of remarkable leaders in Latin America, and this crisis has brought them to center stage. The president of Peru, for example, has been remarkable in reacting quickly to the crisis, setting up quarantine, the country under lockdown, and pushing ambitious economic measures. I think the controversial president of El Salvador, we should be cautious with his particular figure, Nayib Bukele, but I think that he has acted promptly and with intelligence. But once again, when you go back to Argentina, has been another very good example of, I think in some ways, the President Fernandez has responded adequately. But when you go back to Mexico and Brazil, the stubbornness of both leaders has been just completely astounding, even in the sort of example they set in those crucial first weeks. López Obrador insisting, just like Bolsonaro, in going out in public. He's still traveling. I think López Obrador is still going to travel this weekend outside Mexico City, even though his own government is begging people to stay in place, shelter in place.
And he flies commercial, right? Famously, he flies commercial.
He flies commercial, and he goes to visit the mothers, the relatives of famous drug dealers. This sounds like a joke. It truly isn't. He did that with El Chapo's mother just recently. So when you have that kind of leadership, it's just mind-blowing. And in this particular moment, you need serene, smart, and even humble leadership. And in Latin America, as we've seen so many times before, if you evaluate leaders, the result is pretty uneven, to say the least.
Well, I am tempted to continue this for another few hours, but I'm mindful of everyone's time and the fact that we promised that we're going to keep these to an hour, but this has lived up to my indulgent expectations in terms of wanting to spend some time with the two of you. I should mention before we say goodbye that among the dozen or so León Krauze roaming the world, one of them is an important historical figure in connecting us at Future Tense more with Mexico. We've talked a fair amount about Mexico in this conversation, but León is part of the leadership of Letras Libres, a magazine that was founded by your father, Enrique Krauze. And Letras Libres has a publishing agreement with Slate and with Future Tense. And I was recently very fortunate to be able to edit one of our Future Tense fiction stories with Juan Villoro, a very well-known, excellent Mexican author. And he wrote a speculative piece of fiction that looks at some of the, thinks about the future of globalization. He actually drops a reference to COVID-19 in this story that is set in the sort of intermediate future. It's a story in which a Mexican populist leader and China have conspired to turn vast swaths of Mexico into sort of a massive recycling plant for US waste. The trade, speaking of globalization, the trade and waste and recycling is a fascinating story. And China has obviously, for quite a few years, was a net importer, and it was a great profit maximizer for them. And then, as China develops, they're looking for third places to do that. And so there's this wonderful story that Juan has written that's very much focused in a Mexican village and looks at the sort of, the local culture and the mind control technology there's involved. I don't want to give too much away, but we are having a conversation with Juan on one of these web chats next Wednesday as part of our activities of ASU programs in Mexico. So you can follow us on Twitter at ASU_MX. And then the Future Tense programming, you can follow us at Future Tense Now. And next week, Tuesday and Thursday, we're having some of these socials that I think we've teed up nicely today as well. On Tuesday at the same hour, 4 o'clock East, we're doing one with the Boston Globe and their editorial page editor on thinking about climate change in the wake of coronavirus with Bina Venkataraman, who is their editorial page editor and a Future Tense fellow. And then Thursdays, Future Tense Social Distancing Social will be on the question of, will the coronavirus claim privacy among its victims?
Wow.
So really timely subjects. But today was so much fun. Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you, Leon. And thanks to everybody who was able to tune in. And please keep coming. And hopefully we can get through this period together. So thanks, everybody.
My pleasure.
Andres. Thanks, Leon. Stay
Thank
healthy.
you, guys.
Bye-bye. Thanks.